That oil pressure light doesn't warn you and confirms that your engine's already started to destroy itself. And most drivers first notice it while sitting at a red light after the damage has already started. If you've ever seen the oil light flicker for a moment at a stop, then disappear the instant you touch the gas, that wasn't a glitch. The engine's hot. Everything sounds normal. No ticking, no knocking, no warning chime. But inside the engine, the oil film that keeps the crankshaft floating is starting to thin. Metal is starting to brush metal for fractions of a second at a time. The oil pressure light is still off. By the time that light finally flickers, the damage that leads to a $3,000 to $8,000 engine replacement is already in motion. Not because something suddenly broke, but because the protection quietly disappeared minutes, miles, or months ago. And the most dangerous part is this: your engine can be doing this right now with the dashboard completely calm. See, inside the engine, oil does far more than coat parts. It creates a pressurized film that physically separates metal surfaces that are never supposed to touch. Crankshaft journals don't ride directly on bearings. They float on oil. Camshafts live because oil arrives under pressure before metal ever meets metal. Nothing feels wrong at this stage. And that's exactly why engines cross this line unnoticed. The oil pressure warning system doesn't monitor the quality of that oil film. It doesn't measure bearing clearance, nor does it account for oil temperature, engine load, or wear history. In most vehicles, the system relies on a simple pressure switch. Above a set threshold, the light stays off. Below that threshold, it turns on. There's no early warning sign. There's no gradual concern stage. It's binary by design. Now that threshold is dangerously low. In a lot of engines, the warning light activates somewhere around 5 to 7 pounds per square inch. That number's not healthy pressure, it's survival pressure, and even then, that's being optimistic. At highway speeds, engines typically rely on several times that amount just to maintain proper separation between moving parts. Dropping to a single-digit pressure means oil's still present, but it can no longer hold the load consistently. Now, oil pumps don't create pressure on their own. They move volume. Pressure is created by resistance inside the engine, mainly at the bearings and the journals. Now, as an engine wears down, those clearances slowly increase. Oil leaks out of those spaces faster. Resistance drops. Pressure drops with it. Now, this happens gradually over tens of thousands of miles without any warning light, noise, or change in how the engine feels. The sensor can't detect this early loss because it's not designed to. It waits and only reacts once pressure falls below a critical minimum. By then, the oil film has already collapsed in high-load areas. Microscopic metal contact begins long before any sound reaches the cabin. The engine is no longer fully protected, but the driver is still confident because that dashboard is silent. Damage doesn't begin with knocking. It begins with heat. When oil pressure drops below its effective operating range, the oil film thins. The crankshaft journal moves closer to the bearing surface. The two no longer float apart cleanly. They brush. Now that contact creates heat. Heat thins the oil even more. Thinner oil escapes faster through worn clearances. Pressure drops further. The process feeds itself. Rod bearings are usually the first to suffer. They handle an enormous load while changing direction at high speed. Once their soft surface coating begins to smear, wear accelerates rapidly. Clearances open up further, allowing even more oil to escape. Pressure drops system-wide, not just at the rods. But still, the engine may sound perfectly normal. Camshaft journals follow. Overhead cams rely heavily on consistent oil pressure, especially at idle when pump speed is lowest. Starved cams don't always announce themselves with noise. They score slowly. They shed microscopic metal particles into the oil. These particles circulate through the engine, accelerating wear elsewhere. Main bearings are often the last. When they fail, the engine fails with them. By the time a deep knock becomes audible, the damage is no longer something that can be managed or reversed. The warning light often turns on somewhere in the middle of the chain, not at the start. It appears after meaningful damage has already been done. And this is why engines so often seem to fail suddenly. A car drives fine for months, then one day it knocks. The reality is that the engine was whispering the entire time internally. The oil pressure system simply stayed silent until the situation crossed a predefined failure point. Real-world scenarios make this even clearer. A car idles at a stoplight after a long drive. The oil, it's hot and thin. Engine speed is low, bearing leakage is high. Oil pressure dips below the threshold for a moment. The warning light flickers, then disappears as soon as the driver touches the throttle. Nothing feels wrong, the engine doesn't stall, so the driver just keeps going. Now that flicker wasn't a glitch, it was a measurement of how little margin was left. In that moment, oil pressure was no longer sufficient to fully support bearing load at operating temperatures. A small amount of damage has occurred. The next drive heats the oil faster. Pressure drops sooner. The flicker becomes more frequent. Still, the engine sounds fine. Another scenario happens at the highway level. Sustained speed heats the oil. Worn bearings leak more at temperature. Pressure remains just high enough to keep the light off at speed. Then the driver exits, stops at a light, and the light comes on solid for the first time. Now at that point, the crank journals have already been running marginally for miles. The light didn't miss the problem, it arrived after it. Once pressure loss reaches this stage, every drive becomes a gamble. Engines that failed with no warning almost always had a warning, just not the kind that drivers expect. The system doesn't warn of declining protection, it confirms a critical loss. If this kind of explanation is useful to you, subscribing helps me keep on making more videos just like this one. Alright, so this isn't about carelessness, it's about false confidence. See, drivers are taught implicitly that warning lights exist to protect them. In the case of oil pressure, that belief is grossly misplaced. Thing is, this system, it's not predictive, it's reactive, and it always reacts late. And what's scary is that even well-maintained engines are vulnerable to this particular design. Fresh oil doesn't restore worn bearing clearances. Regular service can't reverse mechanical wear. As engines age, pressure margins shrink regardless of maintenance history. The warning system doesn't adapt to that reality. In modern engines, they complicate this even further. Thinner oils are used for efficiency and emissions. Thin oil flows quickly, but it also loses pressure margins sooner as wear develops. That means the gap between everything is fine and warning lights are on becomes narrower over time, so there's a lot less buffer. The most dangerous operating condition for oil pressure isn't high speed, it's hot at idle. See, at idle, the oil pump turns slowly. Oil temperature is highest. Leakage through worn clearances is greatest. Pressures is at its weakest. Now that's why warning lights often flicker at stops instead of on the highway. That flicker's not harmless, it's evidence that the system is operating at the edge of failure. Now once that edge is crossed, luck plays a larger role than protection. Some engines survive thousands of miles after the first flicker. Others fail quickly. The difference isn't a warning, it's a tolerance and chance. When bearing wear progresses past a certain point, no oil change is going to undo that. No additive can rebuild lost clearance. No sensor replacement is going to restore pressure. The repair path narrows rapidly. Bearing damage leads to crankshaft damage. Crankshaft damage leads to engine replacement. What begins as invisible pressure loss becomes a repair bill measured in the thousands of dollars. The oil pressure light didn't fail. It did exactly what it was designed to do. The problem is what drivers believe it represents. It doesn't warn of danger ahead, it reports damage already done. And that's why engines with perfect service records still fail without warning. Not because they were neglected, but because the protection was quietly fading long before that dashboard ever started talking. Make sure y'all subscribe if you'd rather prevent failures than pay for them.